you're looking at 7.2 trillion US dollars globally. That's around 8.2% of the global equity market capitalization. China's green economy is huge. And if we look at many of these value chains, China plays a central role, whether it's the solar industry, the wind industry, electric vehicle industries, batteries. Where we see the most attractive part of the green economy is actually in things like energy efficiency, that may be less obvious, but where you have more attractive market structures, higher margins, and a greater ability for incumbents to dominate some of these value chains and generate high returns.
绿色经济是全球市场的投资热点。伦敦证券交易所集团近期发表报告，梳理全球绿色经济的发展和投资趋势。今天我对话伦敦证券交易所集团可持续投资研究主管 Jaakko Kooroshy。Mr. Kooroshy, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Hangyu. It's great to be here.
You recently released a report Investing in the Green Economy 2024. So how do you assess the development of the green economy at a company's level?
So the green economy, what we mean by that is all the businesses and value chains that produce products and services that address environmental problems. LSEG is a huge data and index provider. And so we've been working on measuring the green economy for many years now. Since 2008, actually. And what we do there is that we have something that we call the Green Revenue Classification System. It works a little bit like an industry classification system, but it looks at all of the green activities. And then for 19,000 companies, we will go into bottom-up assessments, revenue line by revenue line, to see, okay, which companies have exposure to the green economy and how much of their revenues derives from that green economy. And so that gives us a unique data set. We call it the FTSE Russell Green Revenue data set. And that is what we use in this report to measure the green economy.
What are your key findings in this report?
So when we look at these 19,000 companies, there's around 4,000 of them that actually have some form of exposure to the green economy. In most cases, that can be quite small. So around half of the companies have less than 20% exposure to the green economy, and they may be involved in many other businesses. But we also find around 500 companies that we would describe as pure plays, where you have more than 80% of exposure in the revenues to the green economy. You can also think of this in terms of market capitalization. And so if a company has 20% of their revenues from the green economy, you can say, well, 20% of their market cap should also be considered as green. And so in market cap terms, you're looking at 7.2 trillion US dollars globally. That's around 8.2% of the global equity market capitalization. And that is actually huge. That's bigger than the energy sector, that's bigger than the banking sector, and it's not far off sectors like healthcare or industrials. Now, the next thing that we can do with this data set is that we can actually see, okay, well, what's been the growth rate of that market capitalization? And actually, if you look at the 10-year compound annual growth rate, that's 13.8%. And that's really fast. So if we compare the growth of the green economy to other sectors, there's actually only one sector in our entire coverage, the technology sector, that has gone faster than the green economy. So it's a very large and a very fast growing growth opportunity. And that's why we refer to the green economy as this kind of generational investment opportunity, only behind the tech sector.
What is the driver of the growth of green economy?
Well, it's obviously the low carbon transition plays a huge part. So we wouldn't have companies like Tesla or BYD without that shift to electric vehicles. Around the world, in China and elsewhere, we're facing these environmental challenges, and we have these companies that are helping to solve those problems. So that generates huge amount of demand.
So you mentioned the 10-year compound annual growth rate of market capitalization is 13.8%. Does this growth rate vary in different years? Is it getting faster?
So what we find with that growth, while it is very high on average when you look over long time frames, it's actually also very volatile, right? So we see a massive acceleration of the green economy in 2019, 2020, 2021. We then have in 2022 with various drivers such as the war in Ukraine, inflation, we actually see the green economy declining a little bit. It has then since come back throughout 2023 and into 2024. But so, it's not necessarily a smooth ride, if that makes sense.
And what are the challenges in the development of a green economy?
Yeah, there is actually a number of different challenges, right? So one is this very cyclical nature, right? So you see high growth over long time frames, but then you have some quite brutal downturns that can get investors caught out, right? And we have that behind us in 2022. But when we look over longer time spans, we have seen that cyclically coming back. So as an investor, you need to be careful not to get caught out. I think the other thing that we see is that it's not always easy to gain exposure to this trend, right? Because as I mentioned, there's a lot of companies out there that have just a little bit of exposure to the green economy. And while that exposure and while those business lines may grow quite quickly, to gain exposure to that, you may have to invest into a company that is involved in a lot of other businesses, and in many cases also involved in the downside risks, right? So you may think of a utility that has a lot of traditional power generation. They may have a very fast-growing renewables business, but on the other hand, they also have these traditional energy sectors, and so you might get a mix of exposure from the upside opportunities and the downside risks.
Let's talk about China. How is China's green economy development, and what are its characteristics?
So China's green economy is huge. And if we look at many of these value chains, China plays a central role, whether it's the solar industry, the wind industry, electric vehicle industries, batteries. So now a lot of the green economy in China is not necessarily in the listed equity market, right? So we have a lot of state-owned enterprises, etc., that are driving that green economy. But there is also that exposure in the equity market. Actually, if we're looking at green revenue in the listed market in China, we find around $780 billion in green revenues. That's around 16% of the global green economy, of the listed green economy. And that's only second to the US. Right, so we find companies like, particularly in the electric vehicle value chain, that dominate the green economy in China. Companies like CATL or BYD, but also solar power companies like Yangtze Power and many others. If you're looking at it in terms of market capitalization, actually, the Chinese equity market, the share of the green economy is a little bit higher than the global average, around 10.5%. So from our perspective, the green economy is particularly strong in China, a very dynamic space, both in the state-led economy, but also in the listed equity markets.
How do you predict the trend of green economy, and could you also give us some forecast?
So what I would say, we as a data provider, we're not necessarily in the market prediction business, but I think what we see globally and in China is that the green economy continues to expand. And that makes sense if you think about the underlying growth drivers, right? We need to decarbonize our economy and deal with the issue of climate change. So that creates this underlying driver for demand growth in the green economy. And so we've seen over very long time frames that expansion. Now that will also continue in China. How exactly the global composition of the green economy will evolve is actually quite hard to predict. And one of the factors that we've seen in recent years is actually just decoupling of supply chains, duplication of supply chains. Now that is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, you see subsidies coming in, but at the same time, these green value chains have been very global. and extremely efficient, highly competitive supply chains. And if you see a lot of duplication coming in, you might see some inefficiencies creeping in, and the price reductions may be slowing down. So there's really a mixed picture there.
What investment clues can investors get from your report?
So in the report, we not only look at the green economy in equity markets, but we actually also look at the fixed income space with green bonds. We look a lot at things like valuations. Actually, if we look at the valuation premium of the green economy, greener companies tend to trade on a premium. That premium is actually at a 5-year low currently, according to our latest data. And what's really interesting, that actually the most obvious parts, green power generation, solar and wind companies, those are actually the poorest performance and have been the poorest performance over long time frames. Where we see the most attractive part of the green economy is actually in things like energy efficiency, that may be less obvious, but where you have more attractive market structures, higher margins, and a greater ability for incumbents to dominate some of these value chains and generate high returns.